Yes, is everybody having a good sound? Can you hear me? Can you see me? You're warmly welcome to turn on your cameras, and we'll have a more of an interactive conversation, which is what we aim to. Like our colleague Charles used to say, collective brainstorming. This is what we're here for.
Hello, Christina. How are you?
I'm doing good. Thank you. How are you?
I'm good.
All right, I suggest with everyone's permission, I would like to start because we have such a fantastic session, I believe, in front of us. So good afternoon, colleagues and participants. I am absolutely delighted to extend a warm welcome to you all to this interactive panel conversation on the role, the relevance, and the principles of adaptive leadership for sustaining peace in this turbulent world. The Geneva Centre for Security Policy, the International Leadership Association, the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs, and the Effectiveness of Peace Operations Network are very pleased to meet you. And we're also very pleased to be co-organizing this event at the International Leadership Association's annual conference 2020, focused on leading at the edge. Indeed, in the current uncertain, fragmented and pandemic environment, effective and impactful leadership is as critical as ever. What principled leadership priorities, characteristics, and behaviors are required to lead in today's transformational world? What lessons, if any, can be learned from the peace operations context, where uncertainty, crisis, and conflict are standard features of the leadership domain? Over the next hour plus or so, we will be exploring key adaptive leadership principles that we suggest are needed to steer peace building and peace operations, especially, but not only through major disruptive events like that of the COVID-19. We will explore leadership lessons and practices made by current complex peace operations and the related key stakeholders. And we will seek to use these lessons and practices to generate, to qualify, or to support the adaptive leadership concept. And the ultimate aim of this project is to share the arrived at principles with policymakers, practitioners, educational and training institutions, primarily in the area of peace and security, but also, and in particular, I should say, in peace operations and peace building. And I would also like to mention, I will soon also introduce the panel and go forward, but I also like to recognize my colleagues, Peter Cunningham and Patrick Sweet, who are co-directing the Geneva Leadership Alliance, who's also involved in this project. So, what are the adaptive leadership principles or dimensions that we speak of? Well, the original generic ones were developed by the Harvard Kennedy School and Ron Heifetz, whom you're all well acquainted with. And they are essentially centered around the 5 imperatives of, first, to embrace uncertainty while navigating complex environments. And second, to encourage innovation and experimentation. And third, to lead with empathy and prioritize inclusion. And fourth, to lead through self-correction and reflection. And finally, to inspire and create win-win solutions. To ensure that we make concrete progress in this project, we have invited an extraordinary panel to contribute to our conversation and mission. And first I would like to mention, and I will introduce them as we go along with their interventions. So first I'd like to hand over the word to Dr. Cedric de Koning, one of our co-organizers of this event. He's a research professor at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs and the Center on UN and Global Governance. He also manages the Training for Peace program and the Effectiveness of Peace Operations Network, which I mentioned, which is a global network of research institutions. It's absolutely fantastic, doing great job. And they fed in the findings to our first panel on this topic at the Geneva Peace Week a few days ago. Cedric is also senior advisor with Accord and has 30 years of experience in research, policy advice, training, and education. Essentially, every aspect that you can think of that would be relevant for our conversation today. But we need to hear from you and not from me, so I will stop here. Cedric, over to you.
Thank you so much, Annika, and lovely to be with everyone on this session and this panel and on this topic. I'm just going to share my screen and see, there we are, that one. So I hope you can all see my screen. I'm going to talk on adaptive peace, specifically in the context of peace operations or United Nations peace operations, of course, about adaptive leadership. So some of you may not be familiar with peacekeeping. So in very short, as you know, these are operations that the United Nations deploys on authority or on the mandate of the United Nations Security Council, typically to help to manage a ceasefire or to help to implement a peace agreement. And there's currently about 13 of these operations worldwide, involving almost 100,000 people, budget of about $6.5 billion. So it's quite a large enterprise. It involves a number of soldiers that are contributed by the different countries, the member states of the United Nations, but it also involves police and civilians. Alongside these kind of peacekeeping operations, we also have another broader set of tools, of course, things we call special political missions, which are similar, but just civilian and political missions with not involving, armed units, not involving the use of force if necessary and so forth. Of course, mediation and a much broader set of tools. But if we narrow down on the more specifically on UN peacekeeping for this particular session, what I wanted to focus on is, in a sense, is the unique leadership context that we find in these situations. So these operations are led by a special representative of the Secretary General. That's the most senior civilian in charge of these missions, typically at the level of an Under Secretary General in the United Nations system. But the missions are led, or the SRSG oversees a senior leadership team made up of a force commander, typically 1 or 2 deputy SRSGs, a head of mission support, a police commissioner, a number of people like that. And that kind of team concept is quite important, and we'll come back to that. But what I wanted to emphasize in this kind of unique leadership context is that these people, the SRSG and the force commander and others, do not have control over their own vision and mandate in the same way that, let's say, a CEO of a company can determine what you want to focus on, or a leader of a government can constitute their own vision for what they want to achieve in the next couple of years. And nor are they in control of their own budget. That is determined by the General Assembly. They can't hire or fire their own personnel. They can't. They have a degree of influence over the choice of personnel. But essentially, that changes a lot of the different, let's say, control mechanisms that a leader often have over their team or their company or whoever they work with. And the other thing that's also interesting in this context is that a peacekeeping operation would operate as one of many different international agencies and presences in the country, and of course together with the host government and alongside many other actors in the country. And there's a kind of an expected responsibility of the head of the United Nations mission to coordinate this international effort, but again no means or clear authority to do that. So that means a lot of the leadership has to be exercised in the form of persuasion, negotiation, process facilitation, and you have a position of influence. There's an expected role that you have to play in terms of leadership and coordination, with very little authority to do so. So that creates, I think, on the one hand, a very interesting leadership context. On the other hand, I think the interesting thing to notice is, of course, the terrain, the environment within which this leadership takes place. So obviously you can imagine these are missions that are deployed into situations that are just coming out of conflict, or some of them have still conflict ongoing. So these are highly complex, dynamic political contexts. You need the consent for most of these operations of at least the host government, but typically the parties to, for instance, the ceasefire agreement. But at the same time, you also need to influence them to try and influence them not to, for instance, choose violence as an option to pursue their interests, or in various other ways in terms of executing the task that you have from the United Nations. And of course, peace is not something that can come from outside. It has to come from within the country itself, from the political elite, from the people involved. And so the role is very delicate in the degree to which from the outside you can have an influence into the situation. So typically there's a huge amount of crises that happen in this kind of very uncertain situation. So frequent instances or moments of crisis that these leaders have to manage. This past year, of course, we had COVID-19 as an additional stressor that really influenced the situation as well, and these missions had to manage the situation to make sure that they do not become vectors for the disease themselves. At the same time, they had to, of course, continue to carry out the mandate that they received from the Security Council. So how do you manage in this very difficult circumstance with very little control? And I think this is where the adaptive leadership concept is so interesting and useful. I have worked on the concept of adaptive peace operations and adaptive peace building, and I'll kind of combine these two things in what I'm going to say now. But essentially, we know from the study of complex systems that when you deal with a high degree of uncertainty and a non-linear, high fluid situation, one of the best ways to manage that type of situation is through an adaptive approach. In other words, you do not come with a predetermined solution, but you have to work out the solution as you go along through experimentation, and that's where the adaptation comes from. So I've highlighted 4 points here that I thought would be interesting to focus on. First of all, in this context, that the way that you deal with the conflict has to come and be emergent from the context itself. So you have to identify and analyze, for instance, the drivers and the key actors that determine how the situation is evolving. And because those are the actors and the situations, the drivers, the trends that you need to try and influence as a peacekeeping operation. And then in terms of effects-based results, you need to, of course, know in terms of your mandate, what it is you want to achieve. In other words, in which direction do you want to influence the situation, and who are the people, the drivers and the actors that you need to influence, and what is your expected outcome. And then you need to experiment with multiple different interventions, because of course we don't know beforehand which of these will have a better chance of success than others. And even those that have some success, the situation may change all the time. So I think this variety of attempts is a very important element in adaptive approaches. And then you need to have a very active, conscious effort to monitor the outcome of these experiments, and to analyze them and to learn from them, and then to make decisions accordingly. So essentially you undertake this variety of attempts to influence the situation. You monitor them very closely to see what effects they are having. And then you need to have frequent decision points for reviewing these effects, moments where you can make decisions about, okay, let's sit back and see which of these interventions are working, which are not. Those that are not working should be discontinued, or those that are causing harm or side effects should be discontinued. Those that seem to be working, perhaps one can scale them up or increase more variety, etc. And so this regular process of making decisions about how you continue is a very important element of the adaptive approach. And you can, of course, this coming together throughout the organization to make these decisions, to do this analysis, is very useful for generating organizational learning. And it's very important that this happens in a fairly frequent cycle. The kind of once a year evaluation or once in a 3-year program evaluation is too slow to help you to learn and adapt to these very fast-paced situations. Now, one may question whether it's possible to do all of this in the context of a peace operation. And I myself, if you asked me a few years ago, if you think it would be possible to do this, I wouldn't be sure how and where to start. But we actually had a lovely opportunity about 2 years ago to work with the United Nations to develop something called the Comprehensive Performance Assessment System for UN peacekeeping operations. And this is a system that is now used in 9 of these 13 operations. And it basically does what I just explained. There's a process whereby the mission does a context analysis. They, on the basis of that, develop a results framework. On the basis of that, they of course have work plans and undertake various activities. And then very regularly, for instance, on a quarterly basis, they reflect and review in various teams how these activities are contributing to the achievements or the objectives that we would like to achieve. And then decisions are made about how to make adjustments to the work that the missions are doing. So I'll put a link in the chat to where you can learn more about this comprehensive performance assessment system for UN peacekeeping, as well as if you're interested to read more about adaptive peace building or adaptive peace operations, how some of these principles can be applied to the peacekeeping and peace operations and peace building context. But I think this adaptive approach, adaptive leadership, adaptive peace approach is a really interesting way in which to engage with this highly fluid situation that we find ourselves in, as well as a way of bringing teams together, providing a process through which leadership can be exercised, generating the information on which the leaders are able to take the decisions that they need to take, and give you an ability to track over time how you are doing or not. I'll stop there. Thank you very much, Annika, and I'll post those links as I mentioned earlier in the chat. Thank you.
All right, wonderful. Thank you so much, Cedric. That was very usefully setting the scene, and you managed to cover all the 5 dimensions, adding nuances and concrete examples. That's truly excellent. And of course, it would be interesting, I think, later on to hear if you wanted to, if there's another area which you think are sufficiently strong that would warrant another 6th principle. And so if so, what would that be? And of course, it would also be interesting to hear from the force commander what he thinks about the CPAS, the utility of that. But that's maybe a separate conversation. So without further ado, I realized that I forgot to say when we started, all colleagues, that this is being recorded, just so you know. As those of you participating from the conference, you know that you can access the material until the end of December. But therefore, there's no such thing as Chatham House around here today. But we want transparency and we want forward movement improvement. So it doesn't really, that's not the concern. We will, just to let you know, please, if you have questions, put them in the chat. We will be monitoring that. So once we've had the interventions, we'll open up the floor for conversation and comments and so on to hear from you. So please keep it coming. And therefore, without further ado, I have now the great pleasure of introducing Lieutenant General Dennis Gyllensborg, who is Force Commander MINUSMA in Mali, which is one of the most, if not the most complex and challenging mission today. And he just got, after 2 years, he just got his another extension. So congratulations to that, General. General Gyllensborg has vast experience to bring to bear for our conversation here this afternoon. He has held most, I would say, of the senior leadership responsibilities that you can have in his field of work, both internationally and at the national level. He has most recently, before going to Mali, he served as Chief of Defense Staff in Sweden and Head of the Special Forces. He started his career with Arctic warfare as a conscript, and he has then gone through the ranks, operating and commanding in the most difficult environments, and that including in the political life of things as well, too. General Gyllensborg has, outside of Sweden, to make the CV a bit shorter, has served in Bosnia-Herzegovina, Sudan, Brussels, Afghanistan, and the United States. I probably missed something, but that's essentially the main places. He writes books on a regular basis on topics of peace and security and of our common interest here for this conversation. And General Julian Sporre has a number of academic degrees, actually a whole range of them, from different countries, and graduated as the top student from the US Army War College, and has a PhD from Netherlands. That's it, right? No, I think wonderful. We're very, very well qualified colleague who will join us sharing experience from the most difficult of missions on leadership, adaptive leadership. General, over to you.
Thank you, Annika. Thank you very much for your kind introduction, and also thank you for the opportunity to take part in this very timely and important conference today. Indeed, this year has been particularly challenging for us as we had to learn, live and operate during the global pandemic. And the consequences of this dire situation range from the personal inconvenience, uncertainties, to stark and severe increase of systemic inequalities here in the country, but I guess also worldwide. I will begin by giving you a picture of MINUSMA and the mandate and how we intend to implement the mandate and to achieve the objectives set out for this mission. And then I'll sketch some of the things that we have done in the mission during the COVID period here. And finally, I'll share some general conclusions and reflections so far. But first, and thank you, Cedric, for painting the big picture when it comes to UN peacekeeping. Just to add on the more specifics on MINUSMA, this mission in Mali was established in 2013 as a mission to support the implementation of the peace accord in the north. And later on, the Security Council amended our task to include a second strategic priority as the unrest unfolded in the central part of the country. So it's in many ways a distinct conflict and distinct dynamics from the peace accord. And I think it's fair to say that Mali has over the past years seen a continued deterioration of the security situation and also the humanitarian situation, as has the other neighboring countries here in the Sahel region. When it comes to the circumstances we are faced with, indeed they require a significant shift in conceptual thinking and demands us to be more innovative and adapt peacekeeping to overcome the challenges. And just to give you one example, we had a military coup here in mid-August that turned around basically everything on the political landscape. In light of the security situation, the complexity of the environment in Mali and the strategic priority that was added for us have forced us now to develop what is called an adaptation plan, which is fully supported by the Security Council. And here we have aimed at encouraging innovation and experimentation to move forward, to find solutions, not just for the current problems, but also for those that we have yet to define and yet to be exposed to. MINUSMA is an integrated mission, as other big UN peacekeeping missions, comprising, as was said earlier, a military component, a police component, and a civilian component. And for us, the adaptation is indeed a whole of a mission undertaking to involve all these parts of the integrated mission. And that's essential not only to adapt to its current mandate, but also, again, to take the evolving situation in Mali into consideration. But it also aims to addressing other things, in particular when it comes to mission performance. And here I would be able to address or make some comments on CPAS later on there, but that is indeed a tool for us to collectively look at performance. A shared understanding and commitment from the entire mission to reach these desired goals have been essential. Moreover, new ideas, concepts can create concern and uncertainty, and there is an element of change management that needs to take place when we do these kind of quite fundamental changes as we are in the process of doing here. And to me, it's very important to build on the inclusion and the mutual trust to help all the parts of the mission to see the transformation through. This is something that we need to be persistent with and maintain focus on for quite some time. And the adaptation is indeed key to implement our mandate successfully. Now, turning to the COVID-19 situation, and it has had a great impact on all UN peacekeeping missions, and including MINUSMA. It has obliged us to embrace uncertainty while navigating a very complex and dangerous environment. The pandemic, especially in the beginning, I would say, put big constraints on the missions. We had to put in place a series of mitigating measures to protect our troops and also to prevent any risk when it comes to the UN reputation here in Mali. And also to promote safety, security and health for all other UN personnel, while at the same time continue with our operations, continue to focus to fulfill our mandate. Furthermore, we worked closely with the UN headquarters and the troop contributing countries to ensure compliance. We developed a strategic partnership early on with the Malian government, as this was a very strategic concept for all the stakeholders in the country. The UN headquarters took a number of decisions, including to suspend rotations on personnel from April until the end of July. And this had a number of consequences where we stopped rotations, and we had to maintain not only the capabilities, but also the morale and dealing with the uncertainty amongst the personnel. And it's not just that they didn't know when they would be able to return home. Many of our personnel also had quite challenging situations at home with families and friends. We took a set of decisions early on, deliberately to not only to implement the Malian policies and guidelines, but to make our application even stricter, as to ensure the reputational risk, ensure the reputational situation and avoid any risk for our credibility in the country. And the issues that we worked on initially was quite centered in the sense that they had to address the compliance measurement to guidelines when it comes to outbreak prevention and case management through training, communication and education. And this cut across a number of culture barriers, and we did this also during Ramadan, and Ramadan being a a example of traditions where you come together in certain ways that we had to sort of break up to mitigate risk. We had to also to conduct regular health promotion sessions, establish audit and compliance checks to make sure that nobody would deviate from the strict compliance necessary to become successful. And we established quarantine facilities also to be prepared for the worst case. And we did in the beginning not obviously know what would be the consequences in the number of affected personnel. Quite early on, we had 2 death cases, 2 COVID cases that regrettably turned out to be fatal in the mission, and that also put these things in another context. Within the leadership of the mission, we have encouraged experimentation and having several discussions on best practice and share this between the different parts of the organization because we did not know what would work in terms of making sure that we had the measures necessary to ensure the hygiene, to ensure that we will be able to minimize the exposure to the population and so on and so forth. And we had also a number of leadership sessions with those that were out in the sectors and making sure that they also cultivated this kind of experimentation. We had to test different things to find the best way forward and to ensure preparedness in different ways. Communication became absolutely essential, strategic communication to make sure that we have the same understanding of the situation, but also the measures that we are taking. And as important, the things that we didn't know. We had to tell personnel what we did not know, and that was quite a lot. But we put this as one of the priorities for the mission to bolster strategic communication. In the face of the pandemic, we had to adapt the level of ambition in the prevailing conditions also, while ensuring that we didn't lose sight of the mandate. At the end of the day, that was also what we needed to pay attention to. Notwithstanding these challenges with COVID-19, we developed a concept to communicate what we were doing and what the focus were. And we ended up with a concept that revolved around 3 areas: to protect, to partner, and to posture. And it was deliberately a simple concept that could be adopted at all levels of the organization. And protection obviously took as a point of departure COVID-19 measures. We also continued with, for instance, patrolling, but without interacting with the population. We enhanced night patrolling also to limit the interaction and exposure to civilians. We put a lot of effort in information operations to articulate to the population also what we were doing and what we were not doing. And there were a lot of rumors in some areas of the country. But we couldn't isolate ourselves. So partnering became a very important feature also, to work with the Malian authorities to show that we stood shoulder by shoulder to share the burden and the hardship that COVID-19 constituted. And we provided quite a lot of support to the Malian authorities in different ways, logistically and otherwise, as to show that we were in Mali as a part of the solution, not the part of the problem. And finally, when it comes to posturing, this was our way of articulating the need to self-correct and to reflect on the situation and to continue to adapt to the circumstances and trying to understand how to best mitigate the threats. And we had also to lead with empathy because this was a difficult situation and still is in some ways at so many levels. Personally, with regards to those that passed away and their colleagues that had quite a difficult period, but also to make sure that we led by example. So whatever we took forward as principles, we had to show that the senior leadership was not just behind it, we were leading by example, applying these strict measures on ourselves more than we can demand by the personnel. And our biggest responsibility was to ensure the personnel, military, police and civilian, that they were able to maintain their resilience and morale. And the ultimate goal in these circumstances has been a successful implementation of the mandate, while at the same time dealing with the ongoing uncertainty and the ongoing threat towards the personnel. Bearing in mind also that the healthcare in Mali is not ideal to address and take care of personnel when it comes to COVID-related effects. So that's my very short reflection on that, and I'll be happy to elaborate more on details if needed. Thank you.
Works better if you unmute, right? So thank you so much, General. That's a lot of food for thought, a lot of concrete examples. Very much appreciate the fact that you covered all the principles that we had put on the table and added a lot of very practical and also more strategic issues related and connected to those principles. And also just noting that, of course, embracing uncertainty, the first principles you had to adopt all the way long before COVID happened. And then, of course, adding COVID, adding the coup, adding everything else around. It's just extraordinary what you managed to do, the whole mission manages to do in Mali despite everything. And I think it's also particularly interesting with the three, the protect, to partner and to posture, that also these very much, I think, both enriches the conversation that we're having, the principles and so on, but also adding other interesting cross-cutting aspects to the issue. So thank you very much, truly excellent. And now it is my equal pleasure to introduce to you our next speaker, Victoria Tori Holt, who is Vice President of the Stimson Center in Washington, DC. Prior to this, she was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State responsible for multilateralism. That was before it got into crisis, I should add, and peace operations during the whole Obama-Biden administration. Those of you who are from the peacekeeping world will know that she is also the thrust behind the successful elevation of protection of civilians as a core business for UN peacekeeping. And Victoria was also the lead and driving force behind the Leaders Peacekeeping Summit hosted by Obama in 2015, and Biden hosted the precursor in 2014. Her CV is much longer, of course, but now we want to hear from you. So that was just an appetizer, not only of prior to our session here, and hopefully also things to come in the next few years. So Tori will share her policy and practitioners' perspectives on adaptive leadership in support of UN peace operations. And of course, congratulations on the US elections for everybody, I think. Tori, over to you.
Thanks very much, Annika. And I really appreciate being on this panel and being given the chance to think about adaptive leadership. I was looking at all 5 elements, and I thought, I can't imagine an institution more than the UN that in some senses goes through all these cycles. So, but before I go there, I'll just say, I think looking at leadership in the world today is critical. And whether we look at the level of displacement at 80 million people around the world, we look at the growth and challenge of climate change. We see the rise of authoritarianism and the lack of human rights, ongoing conflicts, which have often gone from localized to internationalized, the growth of proxy wars and non-state actors. I think leadership is what we all both want and also can ourselves employ. And I think one of the characteristics of the adaptive leadership model is this is not just about a hierarchy. It's empowering everybody, every individual, and maximizing and rewarding what they can do, and also rewarding them as individuals for taking on hard jobs, whether they succeed or fail. So I think that spirit is exactly what our moment needs. So I'll keep my comments relatively short, since I think we all value the discussion. And Annika encouraged me earlier to maybe stray from some of the completely familiar territory, but I will probably stomp around on it just slightly. So to say about peace operations, first of all, about uncertainty and complexity. I don't think you can design something that's more about uncertainty and complexity. The nature of peace operations is well described by Cedric, is that they go to places that are not full war and not full peace. So right off the bat, there's no guarantee. And so the leaders go in knowing that they have 2 or 3 major jobs to do. One is to support a peace process. That does not necessarily mean just the peace agreement, and we can come back to that because it gets to the inclusion point. The peace agreement may be the start. It may not actually be the end of what creates political stability. Likewise, protecting civilians is both an immediate urgent task that every mission faces, whether it's the top task for the page 16 of the Mali mandate, it's not, but, and that supports the political peace. And yet a leader has to also give a vision, manage, be the top political negotiator at times, and think about how to handle anywhere from, you know, on the average over 10,000 employees. So Cedric's charts are right, but there is also a magic sauce here, I think, about vision and flexibility in the shortness of time. We have a lot of tools that the UN's created, situational awareness and mission training. I could go through the whole list, but let me just briefly mention a few crises I saw and what I found that helped with leadership. There was an earthquake in Haiti in 2010. The top leadership of the UN mission gets crushed in the very building that they were working so importantly to get the peace operation to help Haiti govern itself. The UN stayed, and the leadership came not from the top leadership, who unfortunately many had died or perished, but from the staff who were inspired by them in the first place and then stayed inspired to lead the humanitarian relief that then came waving in great part from military force, including from the United States, led by a humanitarian community trying to join up with the UN. I don't think you could design a more complex, difficult arrangement of different cultures and institutions, but I really saw people rise to the equation. So I think that's because it was vision and leadership to start with that helped transition that emergency response. Cote d'Ivoire elections in 2010, the nation woke up with 2 leaders. The UN mission had a relatively low-key profile. And then the Security Council took leadership. The SRSG beams into the Security Council and says, my mandate says that I should validate the election results. But we have 2 people who say they're president, should I mediate? And the Security Council in real time goes back and says, no, you call it like you see it and we will back you up. So there's a case of leadership aligning political member states with the UN leader and the whole function. And it was a political strategy in the end that most governments and most countries came behind. It was not use of force. The third is South Sudan. In December of 2013, this young nation, there was underestimated political fractures within the government and within the country, and the leadership turns on itself, calling up their own militia. Civilians flee to UN compounds. Certainly not the first time this had happened, but on a scale unimagined and certainly undesigned by the UN to absorb tens and now and then over about 200,000 people for physical security, sleeping in behind the gates. And in that moment, that leadership of the mission was not just the SRSG, it's people like Ken Payama, who was in Bor a few months later when the SPLA shows up and wants to come in, and he, unarmed with 2 colleagues, says, no, close the gates, you can't. It saves lives. So I think at some level what I see as leadership is the vision being inculcated within the personnel of the mission. They feel not just a moral, but a political backing for their actions, and you can't always plan for that, because in a moment of crisis, people make decisions very quickly and very swiftly. Now, there's also crises that don't always work out well, but I think that the UN is often under-recognized for how much the individuals in a mission can make a difference. This then goes to a positive, some win-win solution for leadership that I'd like to flag. Annika, since you referenced it, the United States became keenly aware that in some of the crises we were facing when I was in government, there was a real lack of just capacity availability. So in the crisis in South Sudan I mentioned, Security Council takes action within 2 weeks, authorizes roughly 5,000 more forces. Everybody's very proud of themselves, very quick action. But then you realize nobody's coming. Why? Why is there a lack of capacity? Likewise, crises in both Mali and Central African Republic, very different kinds of crises, demanded peace operations to be deployed with both a mix of forces, police, and civilian leadership. And yet those missions struggled to get off the ground. So sometimes leadership is recognize a problem in plain sight and making it something that, rather than saying who failed to solve the problem, how can a group of people get together to mutually address it? So in that case, we had it, yes, as you mentioned, then Vice President Biden held a meeting. We didn't really garner a lot more support. We went to the UN and said, give us your list of gaps. What do you actually need? We know you've deployed. You're not supposed to publicize what you don't have, but indeed, you don't have enough French-speaking police officers who are female. You do not have enough engineers and medic units. You need mobile assets, etc. And so we put together a summit where we asked every nation of the world to come and make a pledge about what they could contribute to what the UN needed. And so by creating a process, by recognizing a problem in plain sight, by encouraging leadership, I think it was a very positive approach, kicked off by that summit and then continued by many other governments. There's been now over 50,000 new pledges of the enablers, the police, the civilians, and the military capabilities that were needed. And it was parallel with a process that recognized some of the ideas that are needed to also engender successful peacekeeping. I'll mention one briefly. We could get into protection of civilians, which is a very important area, and it's one that the UN continues to be challenged by, but I would say has accepted more criticism than any institution I know, and adopted reforms and measures to make this iterative, to keep trying to do more and better. But one is engaging women and peace builders at the local level. For now 20 years ago, Resolution Security Council called to involve women at all levels of conflict prevention, not just as victims, but as mediators and leaders. The world has struggled with it, but has created a process that is both now in and outside of government to try and bring it in. So in Liberia, for example, which had the first deployment of female police officers, I once interviewed the head of it. She was super annoyed that everyone cared that she was female, but they engendered a series of women in Liberia who then signed up for the Liberian police force. There was a special court that was created to deal with sexual violence so that the Liberian justice system could move forward. And this is both organic to Liberia, but also because the international community said, this is a problem we see you facing, what can we do to support it? So where do we go from here? I would just say quickly, I think a couple of things I've already mentioned, but recognizing a problem in plain sight is one of those things. And if I'm challenged to come up with what that looks like in a new frame, let me briefly try. Leaders need vision and a process. And in some ways, I would call myself a radical institutionalist. What I would argue for is we need either visionary implementation or audacious implementation. Most institutions have great values written down. They say they believe in the following, they set up structures to do it. And we often run off to create a new resolution or a new structure. But there's a lot in the structures we face. And sometimes they do need to be put out to pasture, but a lot of them don't. So what does that mean? First, recognize problems in plain sight. recast or resell them back to the community that says they want to solve these problems, then give everybody something to do at every level, or ask them to volunteer, because most people care about mission. Most people believe that what they want to use their time and their talents for is solving problems, whether it's at the family level, the community level, or the international level. And then you welcome progress and you keep it iterative so that you communicate where we are. So I'm not sure, I'm not an adaptive leader expert. This is a new world to me, but I would say audacious implementation might be something that could help us all. Thanks.
Well, excellent, Tori, wonderful. And I think you say you're not a leadership expert. It's also the practice implementation of leadership and moving and implementing the vision. Thank you so much for covering the whole range of issues again, but from the political perspective. And also, of course, you have deep knowledge from your research and also from being engaged on peacekeeping, peace operations for decades. And I think very much highlighting both the innovation and the starting off that embracing uncertainty is the departure for everything having to do with peace operations and peace building. You raised inclusiveness and the positive sum game, creating the future. Of course, the good news is again that there was so much food for thought, but it's recorded, so we can come back to that again. Thank you so much. That's very, very helpful. And I would therefore like to, I like the radical institutionalism. I'd like to hand over the word to Professor Mike Hardy, who, as all of you know, is the chair of the International Leadership Association. And we are immensely pleased, actually, we're super thrilled to be co-organizing this and the related meetings with you and your excellent team. Mike is Professor of International Relations and the founding director of the Center for Trust, Peace and Social Relations at the Coventry University. And starting off as an economist and a diplomat, he has since deepened and expanded both his focus and mission to concentrate around intercultural dialogues, innovation and vulnerability, behavioral aspects of building safe and resilient communities, and much, 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 much more. Professor Hardy has had a pioneering role in setting up or being active member of a whole range of global initiatives, organizations, and forums, which seeks to persuade and encourage people to cooperate better, to work together. And this in cooperation with a number of UN and other organizations and countries. And he has also received 2 awards from the British Crown in recognition for all those efforts. And of course, in this day and age and the turbulence that we're facing, there is no better person or place to have you join the conversation than now. Mike, over to you.
Anika, you're very kind, always too kind. But, and it's a very hard thing to do, to follow the practitioners, these that have brought such a rich conversation, but I'll do my best. Just to pick up on Tori's last point, you know, you may not be a leadership scholar, but the scholars in the academy are 2 or 3 steps behind you practitioners. We're trying to keep up. And one of the things that excited me, I left the field. I left being active in the field about 12 years ago to go back to universities because I didn't think we were asking the right questions. And I didn't think the collaboration between the academy and practitioners was helpful enough to create the outcomes and the context that we all want. So we know a lot about positive peace, and we know that it's very difficult to find. We know that we run around patching up with band-aids, things that are problematic. We also know in the academy that the world is moving at a pace that none of us are comfortable with. What's called social acceleration. It's not change that gives us the problem anymore. It's the pace at which that change takes place. But I became really interested. I worked in the Palestinian territories, in Egypt, and more recently in East Asia, in Indonesia and Sumatra. I became really interested in asking a simple question as to why is it that the cultures that we understand and analyze are not conducive to the positive peace that we want, to the security that we want for families and for communities. So let me share slides because it's quicker, I think, just to make sure I don't forget anything. Anika, you'll tell me if they haven't appeared. What I want.
Yeah, please start. I think it's why don't you, it's not there yet, but why don't you start and it'll probably come on.
Okay, bring my shared window to the front. So I'm really interested, as my title would show you, to look at the way in which the ideas of adaptive leadership can be used to promote positive peace and promote the positive culture to which I referred. The details which Cedric's study and which Victoria and the General's experience have shared with us create for me a list of things that we expect good leadership to bring to bear. I'm really concerned that we're not looking at my slides. It's not.
No, exactly. Sorry, it's not. I can't see it. Can
you try
it says that you have started sharing the screen.
You try again. Apologies.
Perfect. Wonderful. Thank you.
Good. Thank you. All right. So I'd start really by looking at what I call the what ifs of leadership. From what we've heard from my three colleagues, there are a set of conditions in the field that create challenge. They create challenge for practice and for leadership. And I really am focused not on leaders per se, as individuals or personalities, but on the process that Victoria talked about, on this notion, and I like to talk more about the phenomenon of leadership, and I'd like us to unbundle that more. It's absolutely the right platform to do this within the International Leadership Association. It is focused on mobilizing our understanding, our knowledge of leadership, in order to create a better world. And what better world would there be than one which provides the sort of security in post-conflict conditions, but the positive peace that we all aspire to in normalcy? So there are 5 points here in the what ifs. If these are what we think are necessary, and hearing from you three, it's very clear that they are, they also translate to Ron Heifetz's work from Harvard. And the great thing about the ILA conference is that we are able to have a little bit of drip feed from Ron. He's here as well, and it's really good to be refreshed, re-energized in his thinking. But these are the things that we need for positive peace and positive cultures, and the things that a phenomenon of leadership could bring about. We should expect change, as we've heard. We should think about the way behaviors are more important than structures. We should listen to multiple opinions. We should be wholly engaged with all participants and stakeholders. And we should make sure not to simply look at the tunnel vision of looking at the implementation of a particular agreement. We should be looking peripherally at the conditions and the cultures that we're seeking to sponsor. We know that the adaptive leadership model values rules, but doesn't hold them to absurd levels, and we expect rules to be broken. We want to be, in other words, into an iteration and reiteration and a dynamic relationship. And we know also that a leadership phenomenon that mobilizes strengths wherever it finds it, not just in the obvious places. And we should find strength in unexpected places and have a culture which allows us those to emerge. And finally, we should reward accomplishment with autonomy. When things are going well, we should back off and allow them to continue to go well at a very local and autonomous way. Now, these things we observe, of course, from our various experiences in particular fields, but they do start floating up to a general understanding of how a leadership phenomenon could be developed within the context of the adaptation that my colleagues have referred to. So if we think this is a good thing and we think it works, how do we get more of it? And that's the reason I returned from the field to go back to school. My centre at Coventry has been built in the last 7 years to focus on some of these issues, not on how to manage human security paradigms or how to provide peace
I don't know. Mike, I lost you. I don't know if the others, do you hear Mike?
No, he's frozen.
Ah. Mike, do you? Do you hear us? Shall we all try to turn off our cameras and see if that releases the bandwidth? Mike? Okay, let's hang on. We're gonna see if we can relocate. Deirdre, are you there? And Bridget?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, let's
now to see what we could do to
okay,
help.
so let's do like let's turn on the cameras again for those of you that had the cameras on that want to be engaged, and we'll just wait for Mike to re-engage. And in the meantime, I would therefore open up. We will return as soon as Mike is back. But if there are anyone who wants to pose a question or a comment already now, we can have that as a kind of a warm-up. We're running a little bit short on time, but this is obviously because the presentations have been so fruitful and dense in comrade. Yes.
Can I ask actually, let me give you a little bit of, I did my dissertation on the leadership competencies within the international court, and I've served as a peacekeeper in a peacekeeping operation in Bosnia when I was with the military, and I helped stood up AFRICOM. So that I come with those lens. Okay, I've had both the practitioner and the, I've commanded operations for peacekeeping operations, so I know a little bit about some of the tensions. And I wrote 2 books one on peace leadership and one on chaos as a gift, leading oneself in a complex environment, talking about peacekeeping operations and the diplomacy and some of that as far as the 3 pillars. And what I wanted to ask was, I like that the adaptive change and the adaptive piece, but I also added change leadership and chaos leadership theories within both of those. And the reason why I did that is because of my experience working with with the tension between NGOs and IGOs that were having different strategic short-term and long-term objectives, especially in the DDR and the SSR, and the stabilization and reconstructive framework from the US ITP. My question is this: how do you think that there is especially in this type of a VUCA environment, do you think that that chaos theory can complement well within the adaptive as you're looking at about that?
Thank you very much. Yes, thank you so much. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. So that was the question that came at the end. So I'm asking the panelists to think about that. I'd like to take, because we only have a few more minutes left, and I know that Tian raised her question early on in the session and then came back again. Do you want to raise your question? So we added more question from Tian. Please.
Basically, I have the similar question. I'm just curious about whether adaptive leadership principles have bumped into any troubles with the different societies with different cultures. For example, UN peace, efforts. I assume we probably use some similar kind of models, but different societies, how did we handle that culture difference? I'm very curious about this. If you could elaborate a little bit, I would appreciate it. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. That was a very complimentary question, and I'm going to see before I ask the panel to comment on this. I don't know if Charles Petrie, do you want to add? I am sure you have a reflection.
I guess I just 2 points, and it's picking up on what Cedric said. I think one of the
sorry, we can. Sorry? If I can just add for the other participants who are not kind of new to peacekeeping, maybe this is Charles is the former Assistant Secretary General, a former SRSG, and a former resident coordinator. So he's just loaded with experience and information. So shoot.
Just very two short points. The first is I think looking at the difference between a special political mission and peacekeeping, and the fundamental difference is peacekeeping is, in addition to trying to find a resolution to a conflict, is actually trying to create the conditions on the ground in order for that resolution to happen. And in that sense, it's got two dimensions to it that make it profoundly complicated. The second is, of course, when we talk about adaptive leadership and we talk about leaders, it's important to understand that leaders of these missions are political compromises. So it's far less the caliber, the ability of the individual to undertake the task, and it's much more sort of the acceptability of the individual in position. So in a way, I think, the adaptive leadership is an incredibly sort of informed way of dealing with a problem. I think it's too much to expect that everybody will have all of the elements, will be able to have all of the elements. Part of them have to be intuitive. Some of these attributes cannot be given at the time of leadership. They need to have been already acquired. So in a way, I would see adaptive leadership as having two components to it. A component which has been acquired, and a component that needs to be given. My last point, and before Professor Hardy comes back, is I also think that there may be a need to decouple the senior political envoy role from the actual peacekeeping, creating the conditions on the ground to allow for a political resolution to be made. But that's a longer discussion. Thank you, Anna.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Charles. And now Mike has come back to us. So the panelists can consider the question that have been raised and the reflection by Charles. Excellent. And handing now back to Mike to continue. I don't hear you. Are you saying something?
Thank you for those last comments, Charles, which I did hear, and I apologize, colleagues. It just went black. And so, but what I was getting around to concluding was that the notion of a type of leadership phenomenon that we want to encourage includes the qualities that we discussed. And this last slide talks, if it works, how do we get more of it? How do we develop a leadership development culture which supports the number of stakeholders and the number of activities, whether it's the military, whether it's civic leadership, whether it's the international community? And these sorts of characteristics I'm interested in how we develop. So how do we get people to be more comfortable with uncertainty? The pandemic and the current turbulence in the world is accelerating, of course, and increasing and amplifying the things that we want to avoid. But part of that is because people are really getting worried and anxious about the nature of their futures for their communities and their families. Can we encourage innovation and experimentation? Can we reward failure? Do we have to have a culture which makes the process of experimentation very difficult? The stakes are very high in peacekeeping, as I know from my experience. So you can't play with people's lives by experimenting, but without innovation, we will not find innovative, new, better ways of bringing sustainable security. How can we seek to find the strength from unexpected places and then mobilize it? How do we find the strengths that we can mobilize for a positive culture and get behind them And how does our leadership process encourage that? And a number of comments already made about the importance of empathy, about sharing goals and sharing understanding, how to stand in other people's shoes. How do we do that better? How do we help the leadership process fight the forces of prejudice and commit to the notions of exclusion, inclusion that we talk about? And what makes self-correction more possible? Can we embed learning? Can we make sure that the learning process is a continuous one? And my final point is, how do we encourage inspiration without relying on celebrity? How do we encourage a process by which individuals can be inspired, can look at role models without the perpetuation of a celebrity culture that sometimes we observe? So adaptive leadership provides, I think, some really interesting insights into process that Tori was talking about earlier. And I think that talking about these in a conference on leadership at the edge couldn't be more appropriate. It is the edge, when we move out of our comfort zones, that we find the most inspiring potential futures. I do apologize, colleagues, for being discombobulated and broken up by technology, but I'll leave it there, Anika. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mike, and thank you very much for pulling it all together and also providing us with a very practical and, I would say, challenging us to move forward beyond the words, the conversations and the kind of the guidelines. But okay, how do we actually generate action and practical progress in this area? So thank you very much. I will be super short commenting on that because we have, of course, a little bit run out of time. But therefore, I would like, if with your permission, if I can ask the panelists to have I would say 1 minute each, if you can pick what the questions to comment on or any final reflections. And as we've said earlier on, this is just the beginning of a process. We've had 3 meetings now in the last few days, 1 at the Geneva Peace Week and 2 here. And we really look forward to working and making progress on this turning adaptive leadership into a positive force for good for peace operations, peace building, and so on and so forth. So can I then invite our panelists, and I will ask Cedric first.
Thank you, Annika, and thank you for the questions, colleagues. On Andrew's question on chaos theory, I mean, just in short, I think precisely the adaptive leadership, adaptive peace has been definitely, I think, shaped and informed by complexity theory and chaos theory, in the sense that these are systems designed specifically to cope with uncertainty and with the non-linear systems where you can't do the traditional type of approach of analysis and planning. So maybe that also leads me to try to answer Kin Young's question about cultural differences. These missions operate both as the missions itself, which are made up of many different nations, and of course they operate in a particular culture. And many of these countries also have multiple cultures in the same country, of course. So it's very much a multicultural environment. And I think, again, the adaptive approach is very relevant in the sense that you cannot know beforehand exactly what may be the right way of communicating. So you have to test different things. You have to learn over time as individuals, as an organization, you know, what form of communication, cross-cultural communication work in some circumstances, doesn't work in some circumstances. And based on the effect that your communication is having, you have to step back, reflect and adapt and change, try something new. So that's very much what the adaptive approach is about, is how do we experiment with and learn from different ways of trying to communicate in this kind of multicultural environment. Thank you, Annika, and thank you everyone for a very interesting session.
Thank you very much, Cedric. And then I have General Gyllensborg. You are muted.
Thank you. A few comments from my side. First of all, when it comes to chaos theory, indeed, it has utility in several ways as we do these operations. And I think one example would be to make decisions continuously. I'm calling it more decision navigation, to take gradual steps while having a clearly identified end state. The way to get to the end state is not something that you can anticipate for a long time. You have to adjust throughout the process, and also allow more delegation. I think this is something that we need to continue to work on within the UN system, also to delegate more, to deal with uncertainty where it occurs more than is the case today. Adaptation and change here is something that has different cultural affiliations, and it's not just the geographical diversity in my mind, it's also, I think, the professional diversity in the mission, being it military, police, and different disciplines within the civilian community. So we come with very different ways of dealing with change, the way we see change. And it's very important to have an inclusive process and to communicate continuously, and also to allow some time for this to mature within the organization. And this is something I think that's all too easy to underestimate, to make sure that there is sufficient time to adopt and to embrace the changes from an individual point of view. Thank you.
Thank you very much, General. Excellent. And then I have Tori.
Thanks very much. I fully agree with the General's point about the diversity, both being an asset and a challenge. And I think that, I don't know chaos theory, but how missions and how the world can maximize that. I'm going to just briefly say, I put in the chat a review we did of political strategies, and just thought I would share a few quick points. If the idea is that peace operations, but broadly, we're trying to have a stable peace. Those strategies should be fed, I think, from an assessment of what's going wrong versus what the counselor might write down in a mandate. And this is one of the things we learned in our research. It seems obvious, but it's not always the way it works. And there should be a two-step process for that. And that political solutions are not the same thing as peace agreements. And there's a lot of literature about how over-investment in the peace agreement actually can enable the conflict to continue well beyond. And so it needs to be iterative. And I would congratulate folks in Mali for knowing and understanding this challenge and trying to create space to build up to what a peace agreement could look like. We've seen overemphasis, and obviously Rwanda is a great example, a horrible example of that. I would list many others. And also, peace agreements don't always stop the killing. So if the goal is peace and also end violence, you've got to do both, and they may not be the same thing. And that's a problem, a bit of focusing on elites. And another reason that inclusion is so important, going local is important, and strategic communications across the mission is important. People also will invest if they see a dividend for themselves. So again, an argument for the local. And then finally, and this is more from a nation state government point of view, strategies work best when bilateral and multilateral are going together, not parallel and not oppositional. And I say that to all of my colleagues who worked in governments, because we can often operate as though we're in separate lanes, and the better we can wed that up, better institutions can operate. So thanks for that. And thank you again for a great discussion. I've learned a lot.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Tori. Excellent. And then we have Mike.
So just a final comment on the process. And we are looking for a phenomenon of leadership which will help us move forward. And I think there are three things that I wanted simply to add to the others, the discussion, this rich discussion we've had. The first is any process must include and use storytelling as much as possible. And we don't see enough of that. We don't see enough people sharing their stories, of listening and hearing. Secondly, we have to be able to have a process where leadership helps with the management of loss, of sacrifice, of people losing things. How many times have we heard in the pandemic people asking when will it be normal again? When will we be normalized? That's also similar in many peace contexts as well. it won't be. We won't go back to some normalcy. And we have to be able to manage that. There'll be loss, there'll be sacrifice, and the trade for that has to be in the benefits that come from the peace that's generated. And finally, in turbulence and rapid change, there's a great tendency for timelines to be shortened when we know the value of lengthening them. So in the process that we encourage, in this phenomenon of leadership, we need to try and mobilize. We need to use storytelling. We need to manage loss and sacrifice, and we need to extend the timelines as far as we can.
Thank you so much, Mike, for those concluding words, and great imperative, I think, for all of us. I would like to thank all the panelists and the participants, of course, also for your very useful and insightful questions. I think we've had a really rich, very concrete conversation, also updating ourselves in this dramatically changing landscape. I would say, hopefully, hopefully things will look brighter, but in the meantime, I think our work on looking at ways in which we can strengthen leadership will be a fairly useful priority for all of us. So we would like to warmly welcome everybody to stay engaged on the topic, to stay engaged on this issue. And of course, also I would like to, on behalf of my colleagues, I know Christina Orsic, our Deputy Director, is part of the group here now, and Peter Cunningham, as I said, who is the point of contact, the driving force for doing the International Leadership Association annual conference in 2021 in Geneva at the GCSP. And I forgot, we are a Swiss foundation, independent foundation, backed by the Swiss government and with 52 countries and the Canton of Geneva as part of our foundation council. So we would like to warmly welcome you all to join us next year. Of course, the topic for next year is much bigger, but we will hope to seek to continue on the leadership drive also from a peace and security and peace building perspective. Peter, do you want to add something? It's good. We're drawing over time.
How could I possibly follow that, Annika? That was wonderful, and we very much hope to continue these conversations and move them toward adding value to practice next year as well, and for the rest of this conference.
Wonderful. Mike, Cedric, do you want to add something?
Oh, thank you very much. I think we're way over time. Thank you so much, colleagues. Excellent conversation, excellent dialogue.
Thanks. And please get in touch. Let's keep talking. That'd be good.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And have a nice evening or morning or wherever you are.